RC from the Mountaintop Joiner Shop here. This is the third part of a video series I've been doing on how to build a wine caddy like this one. And to this point, we spent a lot of time cutting boards to rough length and also milling them by hand. And milling them by hand is a very nuanced process, so I spent a lot of time with that. But now we're up against it. See, I have a commission coming up that I really need to get started on. And I imagine some of you at home are getting antsy about getting to the joinery on this project, just like I am. So why don't we move things along a little bit and get our parts ready for joinery. As always, when I walk into my shop in the morning, I'm getting ready to do some work, I like to take stock of what I have done so far and kind of get my bearings and figure out what the next step is. So if you'll recall, we got these parts milled and I have two long sides here. Each of these long sides is going to be one side of the wine caddy and either a top or a bottom. So I have to do a cross cut on each of these. And each of these boards has a clean edge and a cleaned end on it that is 90 degrees to the edge. So I know what my reference edge and reference end are without having to write anything on here with pencil at all. A lot of times woodworkers will write their own little hieroglyphics on all of their boards to kind of keep track of what their reference edge is. And it's important to keep track of what your reference edge is, but in my case, I don't need to look for a mark. I just look for a clean edge. The other side is rough sawn. The other end is rough sawn, so it's pretty easy for me to tell what's what here. And I also have a shorter piece here. This is going to be the front and back of the wine caddy, and this is going to have to get cut up with 3 cross cuts, which will end up with 4 pieces. And I have a couple of different ways I could go about doing that. I could get out my bench hook and my back saw. This is my cross cut or carcass saw. This is going to be a little bit slow cutting a board this wide with the carcass saw. That said, it will leave a pretty clean cut, and when it exits the end of the cut here, it won't splinter out those fibers so much. So that is a good way to go, but it's kind of slow. My other option is a panel saw like I've been using. This is my crosscut panel saw. This one, however, has pretty aggressive teeth on it. It'll cut really quickly, but when it exits the cut, it's going to splinter out the fibers on the back side of the cut, and it could make the resultant part ugly enough that it's hard to use. But there is a way around that I'm going to show you right now. So this is one of my long boards, which means I need to cut one end of it off so I have a top or a bottom that's about 4.5 inches long. And I can just feel here to know that that's my reference end because it's not rough sawn, it's nice and smooth from my shooting plane. And then I'm just going to put a little mark here with my mechanical pencil at about 4.5. I've already kind of done that, but that's where it is. That's my mark. And then instead of marking it with a pencil to cross cut it, I'm going to mark it with a marking knife. So I'm going to put a square in here, put my marking knife right in that little pencil tick I made at 4.5 inches. Hold that nice and firm and draw a line across it. And I'm going to go over it several times to make it nice and deep. Then what I want to do is carry that line around my reference edge and then on the other side of the board. So I'm going to get in here with a little square referencing from that same side that I just cut. So I don't know if you can see that, but there's my knife line. I'm going to put my marking knife right into that knife line and slide the square over to it and then square the edge. And because this is my reference edge, I know that when I come around to the other side, the line on this side is going to line up with this side because this is square to the end and also square to the face because I've already milled it. So now I'm going to wrap it around the other side and use the exact same technique. I'm going to stick the marking knife right into that knife line that I put on the end, on the edge there. Slide my square into it and make a nice deep knife line on the other side. Nice and deep. There we go. Now you can see that clear as day. That is a deep knife line, and what that does is when I cut on this side of the knife line, and let me put my little tick mark here to denote which side of the line I'm cutting on here. When I cut that next to the line, these fibers that are on the face of the board are kind of pre-severed, so to speak. So when the teeth of the saw pass adjacent to that line, it won't splinter off any of the face grain on the other side of the line. It'll protect it in that sense. This knife line will come in handy again later on when we're shooting the end of that board. And then take it over to my saw bench and cut it with my regular panel saw. One thing I'm doing when I get to the end of my cut is I'm holding and supporting my offcut, and right at the very end of the cut I like to apply just a tiny bit of upward pressure, and that seems to give me a cleaner exit of the saw right here at the end. Now during this little segment of the video you might have been wondering, well, what about the other side of the cut? Won't it splinter out that? And indeed it will. So take a look at that. This is the other side that didn't have a knife line next to it, and you can see how that panel saw kind of splintered out the end there. The reason I didn't really concern myself with that is because I left these rough cut boards extra long. I left myself like an extra 1/4 inch. So I got plenty of room here to remove all this material here where this is splintering and still get a clean edge. In the meantime, I'm just going to take my, what's this thing called? Rasp. I'm going to take my rasp and just remove all those little bits, and we can deal with this when we shoot the end of this later. I'll take quite a bit of material off, and of course I'm going to go over this surface with a smoothing plane too before it's all said and done, and that will clear up a lot of this stuff pretty easily. But one thing you could do to avoid splintering on either side is, if you know approximately what the kerf width is on your saw cuts, you can put a knife line, 2 knife lines, one on either side of where you're going to be doing your crosscut, and that can help you avoid all of that extra splintering. When you go to shoot the ends of your boards, it'll be nice and clean that way. So if it's really critical, you can still kind of get around using a back saw, which will cut very slowly, and avoid that splintering on the ends. Hope that makes sense. So here I am marking the next one, and it occurred to me that there is a little tip here that I could share. So one thing that's a little bit difficult to do sometimes is to hold your square steady while you're trying to draw your marking knife across it. And you know, if your hand is wide enough to span the width of the board, you can kind of grip with your thumb the stock of your square, and then grab with your outer fingers the far edge of the board, and then you can pin down the square with your index and perhaps your ring finger, and that's one way to hold it pretty steady, just like that. Another thing that can make it easier is to use a planing stop. So I'll just throw a planing stop into the bench, put my stock up against that, and now I can press in this direction, and that way I don't need to be able to span the entire width of the board in order to mark it. And a lot of times I'll just have a planing stop over here just in case I run into this situation. It does make it a lot easier. Even if you are spanning the entire board, it's nice to have something to kind of push against to really hold the stock of your square against your reference edge. So just something I wanted to show you really quick. So now I have my 2 long pieces, which are going to be the sides of the wine caddy. I have my top and bottom here. And the last piece I need to crosscut was this piece that was going to be the front and the back. And hopefully you didn't presume to know what was coming and crosscut this 3 times, because if you did that, you done messed up. What I need to do is just cut this down the middle and leave my 2 ends. So ultimately I'm going to have 4 pieces that are just like this, about 4.5 by 4.5, because I still need to drill my holes that create the arch and reverse arch on the front and back before I cross cut these the final time. So I'm only doing 1 cross cut in the middle of this piece to get my 2 4.5 length pieces. So that's been cut. Now I have a nice little stack of squares, or soon to be squares, because some of these need a little bit more trimmed off of them than others. And you'll notice right at the top there, you can see where my knife line is. So I just need to trim this end grain off to that knife line and make sure that I use the smooth edge as my reference face. The long grain is smooth on the side that I did my edge jointing on earlier, and it's rough sound on this side, so we know that's not the reference edge. So I'm going to flip it around this way so that my clean edge is against the fence of my shooting board, and then I can trim it down right to that knife line, and because that knife line wraps around the edge here, it's not going to knock off those fibers as long as I don't do one too many passes. So I get in here and have at it. I'm getting really close to the edge now. You can see your progress pretty easily. Just keep an eye on that. And as I get a little closer, I'm going to back off my blade a little bit. Maybe not that much. Still want to cut some. Until I have taken off that little bit of extra material entirely. And before I take my final pass, I'm going to take a look at this with the square and make sure that I'm cutting evenly. So I'm going to hold it up to the light above my head here. And looks like that's nice and square. Man, looks like I am right on it. So if I were to do one more pass, I'd probably knock off that corner. But because I have that knife line there to kind of pre-sever those fibers, as we call it, we're sitting pretty. So that's what that looks like after you take it down to that knife line. So we know that this one is 4.5 inches from end grain to end grain. Now I need to trim it so it's 4.5 inches long grain to long grain. I'm not going to do that just yet, but keep that in mind. That's coming. So I need to do this one now. This one is clean long grain edge and a clean end grain edge, and so I just need to do the opposite side. Now I'm going to compare that one to the one that I just did, because it's not even necessarily important for these things to be exactly 4.5 inches. What they really need to do is match each other. So I get them as close to 4.5 as I can, at least the first one, and then match the rest of the pieces to it. So I stack them on top of each other and I kind of give them a feel on the end grain here. It helps to set them on end on a nice flat surface too to see. And I can tell that those are the exact same length. So now that I know that one of these is 4.5 inches across from end grain to end grain, I can turn it sideways like this, and I can use that to mark where 4.5 is on the long grain edge that I need to remove still. I hope that makes sense. So this one's got the grain running that way. It needs to be trimmed over here. This one's already been trimmed from end grain to 4.5. So I'm going to put it like that, and that's where I'm going to put a line to trim it down to 4.5. Again, I can get them nice and lined up if I just put them on end, sitting on this surface. I get in here and mark my line. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. That way, regardless of which way I end up cutting this off, I'll have a line to look at and reference. Now, because I know that my end grain is square to this reference edge, I can use either end of this board to reference or put against my reference fence on here. And what I want to do though is to cut this with the grain, right? So I'll put one end down, start trimming it to that pencil line. I'm going to take bigger cuts like that. Take a look at the edge and see how clean it's planing, and that's not so bad. So I think I'm just going to stick with what I'm doing. If it's tearing out really bad, I'll just flip it over and plane the other side. That's one of the advantages of having a big shooting board, is you can use it as a long grain shooting board for smaller pieces like this one. Now I'm going to, again, see that it matches. No, I need to take a little more off. I actually have to take enough passes. Oh, there's some schwipps under there. I need to take enough passes, actually, that pencil line disappears almost entirely. Take a little bit lighter cut. Ooh. maybe one more. There we go. Our pieces are basically, this piece at least, is square now. So I'm going to rinse and repeat on the rest of these. This one has a rough sawn long grain on it that I need to trim down. So I'm going to take that first one I used as a reference. Where did I go? Oh, that's the one I'm trimming right now. And I'm just going to rinse and repeat. A little more. And just for paranoia's sake, I'm going to double check that I am square with my square. Doing all right. Nothing's gotten knocked out of whack. So I'm just going to continue to apply those same techniques to the other two pieces that I have here. And when I'm done, I'll have 4 pieces that are all 4.5 inches square. Now I got 3 of these pieces done, the one I was using as a reference for the other ones, and these 2. I got 1 more left, but this one doesn't have that knife line to show me where to quit planing the end grains. So what I'm going to do here is a little bit different. So I usually just grab a piece of scrap. It's a little sacrificial platform from which to take the corner off of this with my paring chisel. So I have this crane neck paring chisel that for some reason I just gravitated to this width, and this is the one that I use for knocking off the corners of all the pieces that I'm shooting the end grain on. And that way, when I put this reference edge on my fence, that's at the back corner there, and when I plane this end grain and clean it up, it should knock off the fibers at the back side of that cut. What you usually see people do is use a sacrificial fence, but I'm lazy and I don't like to make new sacrificial fences when one wears out. So this is the way I've just kind of done it over the years, and as long as you're not too ham-fisted about it and taking way too deep of a cut, it works pretty good. There we go. Now I have my reference piece and I'm going to set here, and you can see there's quite a bit I'm going to need to take off of here. So I'm going to press it firmly against my reference surface, and it's the side that allows me to put my reference edge against the fence. So this is the corner I need to knock off, and because I have to take so much material off here, I'm going to have to take a bigger chunk off of that corner there with my paring chisel. So I'm going to come here and take a much bigger corner off of this. Let's see if I can get that in focus. There we go. Just past my pencil line where it hits the edge there. I'm going to take a pretty deep cut and take off that extra material this way. It seems like a lot at first, but I mean, it's not enough material that is worth cross-cutting this again. And I can just do this. Now I'm just keeping an eye on that little end. You can see it's gotten a lot smaller. I'm going to start using a little bit lighter cut as I get closer to my line. Now that bevel is almost completely gone, and I have a little bit of material to take off yet, so I'm just going to hit that again. Knock off the corner just a little more. And now I'm going to take this down to my line. Just enough passes that that line disappears. Compare it to my reference piece. Still a little bit proud. There's still enough there that I can work with. There you have it. So that one's trimmed end grain to end grain, and now I just have to do that last piece of long grain, and I will have 4 pieces that are all 4.5 inches square, and most importantly, match each other. Now I'm shooting the end grain on the 2 long pieces, and with these 2 pieces, neither end has been done yet, which means I'm going to have to get in here again with my piece of scrap, knock a corner off. You can see that okay. Now I'm going to put the clean edge against my fence with the rough sawn edge facing me. And clean up the end grain. Get it nice and clean there. Now I can measure from that clean end to the final length that I need. And the sides of this wine caddy are 12.5 inches. So I'm going to put a mark at 12.5. And now that I've done that, I'm going to use that same trick I showed you earlier, where I'm going to put a knife line on that tick mark and wrap it around the end. and that way I'll get a nice clean corner on this guy too. So there it is, I got my knife line all around the end there and across the other side. That line is nice and deep. And I'm going to take the belt and suspenders approach and knock that corner off too, right up to where that knife line is. That way I can be taking big aggressive cuts with my shooting board plane and not have to worry about this end at all. Looks like that. Right up to the knife line, but still leaving enough of that knife line there that I can see it easily. And trim it to its final length with my shooting board plane. You'll notice I move the stock away as I draw back. That's just force of habit. I don't think it makes a huge difference, but some people believe that if you draw your blade across, well, you still have pressure pushed against the blade, that you're somehow dulling it. I don't know if that's true or not. It's just in case it's true, I guess I do it. And now that I'm used to doing it, that's just how I've done it ever since. Real close to that edge now. Start backing off the blade a little bit. Maybe one more pass. That end grain's looking good. So now this one's trimmed to length. All that remains is to trim this side so I can get to its final width. And we'll do that in a minute, but I still have to do this other one. So I'm going to apply the exact same process to this one because both ends here need to be cleaned up. And then we'll trim both of these to their final width. Oh, one more thing before we go on to trimming these to their final width. I have cleaned up one end of this last piece here, and I need to clean up the other end and of course trim it to width. And rather than come over here and measure that 12.5 inches again using a ruler or tape measure or whatever, I'd rather reduce the likelihood of a measurement error and just mark it off the first piece I did. So as long as that first piece is 12.5, we're all good. So I'm gonna line up the reference edges with each other, line up the end grain, so I can't feel the hump there, it's nice and lined up. I'm just gonna mark that excess that needs to be trimmed off with, not a mechanical pencil this time, but with my marking knife. And I'm not even gonna draw my marking knife all the way across these. There's my marking knife line. That's what I'm gonna stick my marking knife into when I put the square up to it, referencing off of the clean reference long grain edge. Like that. Wrap that around the end, other side, and carry on that way. So now I have my two long pieces with the ends all cleaned up on the shooting board, 90 degrees from my reference edge, and these have been trimmed to length to about 12.5 inches long. I did both of them and they match each other perfectly. And now it's time to trim these to their final width. So I have a rough sawn edge here that needs to go away to whatever final width I'm looking for here. And the final width that I'm looking for is 3.5 inches. And that's a small enough distance that it doesn't make sense for me to really use my panel gauge. That would be a little bit overkill for something of this scale. And if I was doing this in metric, I'd be using this Incra T-rule here. This thing is freaking awesome. So what I would do with this is grab my mechanical pencil to whatever distance it is. It has these little laser cut holes in it. I just put my mechanical pencil into the appropriate hole and drag it across, and that basically is a mini panel gauge. This thing is freaking awesome for that. However, this is not a project that I'm doing in metric. I am doing it in English or imperial. And the T-score I have for that is just this little baby guy. And it only goes up to 3 inches, not 3.5. So I can't use that. So what I think I'll do is use a wheel gauge. And that one has already been adjusted to 3.5. You know, that's quite a bit of distance for a wheel gauge, but it's manageable. So that's what I'm going to use to mark the final width on my boards using the reference edge here. So I'm just going to get in here like this, anchor one end against my shop apron, and mark my line. Now, especially in this walnut, this line is going to be hard to see. Might want to darken this line with my mechanical pencil. And that's kind of the beauty of the mechanical pencil is without sharpening, the 0.5 mechanical pencil has a small enough lead that it will follow this wheel gauge line pretty good most of the time. Just like that. So with a gentle touch, I can darken that line and it makes it a little bit easier to see where it is. And of course, I don't know if you can see it or not, because it is walnut. So I'm going to do that on both boards. And then we're going to trim this to final width. What I think I'm going to do is rip cut this. Rather than just playing all that material off, I'll just take a strip off with the panel saw. So we're back at the saw bench. I got this one clamped to the saw bench with some hold fast, and that one's ready to go. And I just want to show you on this other piece really quick. So I actually wrapped that line all the way around the board. So along that side, around the end, all the way around both sides. And the reason I did that is even though a rip saw is much less likely to blow out fibers on the back side of the cut, it still can a little bit, and especially if you get wonky with your saw. So this is a little bit of extra insurance that I don't do that and break away some pieces of the wood that I want to keep here. And what I'm going to be doing with my rip saw is cutting just a little bit away from the line and then trimming to that line with hand planes after the fact. If you haven't got a lot of practice with your panel saws and you want to avoid the extra peril that comes with it, then that's one way to help with that. Or in the case of myself, just haven't practiced with a big rip panel saw in a very long time. This is the most action that this rip panel saw has seen in a few years now that I have a bandsaw in my shop. Let's knock this free. So I left, I don't know, maybe 1.5 millimeters, maybe a fat 32nd, I guess. And you can see on the back side here that the saw did want to tear away some fibers, but my knife line saved it from spilling over into the keeper section of my board. So it's good that I did that, isn't it? You know, I might not be the most steady sawer in the world anymore, but it seems to me like it's a good sign that, like, if you can put something on your saw bench and it doesn't wobble off, you must be doing something right? Let's see if this will actually fit on my shooting board. So my shooting board has a ramped track on it, which means if I go back far enough, this blade ceases to cut all the way down to the level of the surface here. It's close. Let's see what happens. Looks like I'm getting it. I'll show you some alternatives for doing this as well, because not everybody has a huge shooting board like I do. But if you're going to be making a shooting board anytime soon, that's something to consider. So I'm just watching my marking gauge lines and taking it down to it. And when I get close to the line, I take a lighter cut, which leaves a smoother surface. That will require less cleanup later on. Okay, there are plenty of options for doing this, of course. One of them is to make what we call a long grain shooting board, which I've never been a huge fan of. You can also just put it in your bench vise and do it with a regular old bench plane, like a jack plane. And you just got to watch your marking gauge lines and make sure that you hit them all at about the same time in order to keep things square. Or you can use a one-trick pony like this guy here. And I talked about this plane among several others in my one-trick pony video. And this does one thing really well, and that is trim the edges of very thin boards nice and square for you. Put that fence against the face of the board. It's got a skew blade or skew cut, it's angled. Rather than try to hog all that material off with this little plane, is to just use it for the final few passes in order to make sure things are nice and squared up. So I can remove the bulk of the material with my jack plane and then do my final few passes with the iron edge trimming plane. And of course, as always, keep an eye on things and make sure that your blade is actually cutting it square, and it is. And here I have material starting to flake off the edges, which means I am hitting the marking gauge line pretty much all at once here. And now that one's trimmed to width as well. And of course, you'll want to, quote unquote, show it to the other board, stack them together, and see if they feel like they're the exact same width, or put them on edge on a reference surface, press them against the top of the bench, and see if they feel like they are the same width. And they do. That's good enough right there. So now we have just about all of our parts, except for that little piece that fits under the top there, ready to go. They're all cut to final length and to final width. They all match each other. They're all nice and flat, and they're all nice and square, which means the next step is going to be a bit of a doozy. We're going to be getting into the joinery, and that's why this video is a little bit shorter than the others, because the next one is going to take plenty of time all its own. It's going to be joining the sides to the bottom via these hand-cut dovetails. So I'm going to be showing you how to do dovetail layout with a pair of dividers. I'm going to show you how I personally like to saw out the dovetails and how I like to chisel out the waste. And of course, at the end of that, we'll be gluing up the joints. And that will be that for that episode. So I hope you'll stick around for that one. I hope you got something out of this episode as well, and we'll see you then. Now, if you like what you saw here, please hit like and subscribe. It would help me out a lot. Also hit the little bell icon if you want to be notified anytime I release a new video. And if you didn't like what you saw here, keep it to yourself, pal. Or watch one of my other videos. You might like one of those. Thank you for watching.